This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
Your children, maybe, just maybe, your grandchildren. But that's about it when it comes to passing along a family business that you've spent a lifetime building. In a monarchy where ye olde kingdom is expected to be passed down, any objective assessment of an heir's competence would be considered offensive. Unfortunately, some families take this same approach when it comes to the family business. In this Bizgnus Interviews edition, we meet David Bentall, who provides valuable lessons learned from his personal experience as a family enterprise successor and his career advising other family businesses. Would you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sadly, my dad and his brothers were partners in our family real estate and construction businesses started by my grandfather. And after 40 years working together, my dad and my Uncle Bob tragically had a falling out in their relationship. And Doug, as a consequence of that, all the family businesses and all of the real estate assets got sold. And so it was a very painful thing. And I was the only one of 11 cousins working in the family business. And my dad had wanted me to lead the company, so that's what I assumed was going to happen. And so when everything got sold, I found myself in mid-stride in my career going, what do I do next with my life? So it was a pretty painful, very, very painful thing for our family and for me personally. And the good news, Doug, is that people kept asking me to talk about our experience. It was such a bizarre, sad, tragic, surprising story. I found myself after a short time in 4 seasons in downtown Toronto with 1,000 people, black tie dinner, talking about what we did wrong. And that launched my career 25 years ago as an advisor to families in business. So that's what I do now, trying to help them get a better result than we got, Doug. That's a pretty low bar because we did really badly. So to do better than us is what I'm trying to help families do.
For our listeners and viewers who have not read the book, we encourage you to do that before it is made into a major motion picture.
That's right. There is danger of that happening.
Indeed, it is. But from your experiences personally, and from what you have seen in advising other family businesses, what are the big obstacles to successful succession?
Well, Doug, there's many of them. If I look back at our family, there were probably 32 things that we tripped over. So there's lots of things. And I heard your question. You want to know what are the key things, but I think one of the things we need to be alert to is it's actually often a lot of small things. It's often a lot of small things that accumulate. You think about it, snow falling, one snowflake ain't gonna hurt you, but an accumulation over time. So one tiny thing, for an example, in our family circumstance, my grandfather had a heart attack in 1955. My dad went to visit him in the hospital. And my grandpa said, well, son, having come to terms with his own mortality, he said to my grandpa said to my dad, I guess, son, the business is yours now. So dad went back to the office, moved granddad's stuff out of the corner office, moved his stuff in. Now, Doug, in and of itself, that was not a big thing, but it created in my father an expectation that when it was his turn, he could pick who he felt was the next leader. And it created in my Uncle Bob a sense of feeling left out because he wasn't in that hospital room when the business was given to dad. So it was a small thing, but that over time began to attract other concerns. And gradually over time, my Uncle Bob had an accumulation of a great pile of snow of things that were bothering him. But that was one little one. You see how it can be an accumulation, often a very little thing.
How does a family member who's active in the business identify that they're headed onto those shoals?
Well, I think one of the things that I want to talk about today, Doug, is to think about who our heroes are and who we're following. And I think in order to do that, to avoid the shoals that we might get onto, I think we need to get perspective. And if I can think about it this way, I was a young guy who worked really hard, got a proper education for our family business, even worked outside of our family company to get experience to bring it back. But I quite naively was following some inappropriate mentors, virtual mentors. And I think had I had some folks around me, some objective third parties, some independent board members, some mentors who could help me, I might have seen how blind I was. Can I talk about those mentors and how they got me into trouble?
Absolutely. Let's find out the good guys and bad guys in this.
Well, so Doug, at the beginning, my dad and my grandfather were my first two heroes, right? My grandfather came from England, built the tallest building in the British Empire in 1911, was inducted in the Canadian Business Hall of Fame. He was a great family man, great leader. He was a good hero to follow. So I was trying to follow him, be like him. And then my father joined our family company. He was a visionary, fabulous communicator, built our company to about 1,500 employees, one of the 100 best companies to work for in Canada, developed 5 office towers in the heart of Vancouver, a bit like a miniature Rockefeller Center of 2 million square feet in Vancouver, the heart of the city. And he was a good mentor to follow. So I was trying to be like them. So those are the good guys. And then I wanted to be a leader. And so my dad said to me, David, one day I'd like you to run the family company. And so I started thinking, well, what does it take to be like this? So I started paying attention to other leaders. And my dad read about Churchill. And so I wanted to be like him. And Churchill believed never, never, never give up, right? Really good idea. But not necessarily a good idea if you're in a family business and you're having disagreements with others. I became never, never give up, even if I'm disagreeing with my uncle or my dad. Well, I was following, I wasn't at war. Those are really, never, never give up. It's good if you're at war, but not in a family business. And then the other mentor that I took, a virtual mentor, was Vince Lombardi. I was a Green Bay Packers fan, still am. And Vince, I watched the first Super Bowl as a 10-year-old boy in 1965. And, I wanted to be like Vince Lombardi. Who could argue? One of the winningest coaches in the history of professional sport. He believed that winning was not the most important thing. It was the only thing. Well, that's a really good idea if you're playing football, Doug, but it's not a good idea if you're trying to work with others in your family. Because never, never give up, mixed together with winning is the most important thing, is a volatile combination. And I became a problem in our family because I never gave up. I never wanted to give up. And I believed I was always right and I was going to try and win. And so, Doug, I think how I got into trouble was I picked the wrong virtual mentors. And I didn't have anybody around me saying, David, hold on a minute, you're on the wrong path. So does that give you a flavor for how I got myself into deep water?
Well, it certainly does. How did you pull yourself out of that?
Well, frankly, I didn't. I forfeited my chance to run our family business. I lost my career. My uncle decided that he wanted nothing more to do with my dad, wanted nothing more to do with me, took control of the company, sold everything, got rid of us all. So I actually, Doug, am here to share with you that there are dire consequences. You do this wrong, right? I lost my privilege to be involved in our family business as a result.
And the family business then essentially disintegrated.
Yeah. Well, and slightly humorous but telling example. I went for breakfast with my wife around this time, 1986. I was struggling with my uncles and not agreeing with them and puzzling about stuff. And I wanted some empathy from my wife. And I talked to her and she said, I think I got the same problem with you that your uncles do. And I said, what's that? And she said, you think you're always right. And I'm going, what's wrong with that? Because, Doug, that's where I was at. And so I think what I lacked there was people around me who could give me perspective. And if you look at the research of family businesses, Dr. John Ward is probably the most well-regarded researcher in the area of family enterprise, taught at Kellogg University for many years, just recently retired. John says, if you only do one thing to help a family with succession, just one thing, recruit a board of directors with outside independent members. Had I had some men or women around me who could have given me perspective, that would have made an enormous difference. And they might have helped me to choose more wisely the kind of mentors, virtual mentors I was trying to follow.
David, give our listeners and viewers a sketch of your new book. It's not the first you've written.
Right. My new book is called Dear Younger Me. It's written, if I could talk to myself, I would give myself a talking to. about what I could have done, should have done, and would have done differently. And so, Doug, I looked back, over 30 years ago now when everything blew up. And I look back and I wish that I had been more humble. I wish I had been more empathetic. I wish I had been a better listener, more curious, more patient, more forgiving, more grateful. So the subtitle of the book is Emotional Intelligence for Successors, because I'm in the remedial class, Doug, in all of these areas. I lack these things. And so what I've written about, Doug, is how I forfeited my opportunity to lead our business. So for our listeners, anyone who'd like to read my book, it's a cautionary tale. Don't be like David. It's not a good idea. And then at the end of the book, Doug, I lift up 9 virtual mentors that I've taken on. Now you say all the books, but I've got a lot of virtual mentors who I aspire to be more like. And for our listeners today, and anybody who'd like to read my book, what I want to encourage young men and women who are in family business to do is to create their own virtual hall of fame. Who do they want to be like? So for an example, I want to be more like Benjamin Franklin in his humility. I want to be more like Einstein in his curiosity. I want to be more like Nelson Mandela in his forgiveness. More like, I'm thinking about Kim Phuc. I don't know if that name's familiar to you, but if you remember the Time magazine, in the midst of the Vietnam War, there was a 9-year-old girl, the front page of Time magazine, running down the street, having had her clothes burned off by napalm. I've met Kim Phuc, and she says to me, David, whenever I think about that day, I thank God, because her life was spared. And so here's a woman who, in the midst of horrible pain, has found out how to live a life of gratitude. So I want to be like Kim. I phoned her one day. We were talking on the phone. I was interviewing her for a launch event for my book, and I said, Kim, you don't sound quite yourself. She said, well, I just woke up from surgery. Broke my arm. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. Can I call you later? She said, no. I'm so grateful. Kim, you just broke your arm. She said, I'm so grateful. Yeah, but I only broke one arm. I could have broken 2. She lives that way. So I want to be like that, Doug. So my book is about how can we become wiser family business executives by choosing the right heroes. And I'm still a Churchill fan. I'm still a Vince Lombardi fan, but I don't want to be like them because that's not helpful in a family business context.
I mean, this stuff is not really taught in business school, is it?
No, and I'm a graduate of the Sauder Business School here, and also went to the Harvard Business School, and we don't talk about emotional intelligence very much. We talk about how to develop our case study method, and think about what we would do in other people's circumstances. And I'm all for that. I loved my professional education that I had, but I think we don't often talk about who do we want to be like, who do we want to emulate, and how can we cultivate our spirit and our interpersonal skills, and frankly, the word or the phrase, how can we cultivate our emotional intelligence?
Many people listening to or watching will say, wow, that means softness. I need to be tough. I mean, I've got problems, right?
Well, and I agree. Business is tough, but let's think about, for an example, that cultivating humility like Benjamin Franklin did. Here's a guy who, was a luminary as a scientist, as a business person, and one of the founding fathers. So he accomplished a lot, and so he was a tough, hardworking character. He was no shrinking violet, right? But in reading about Benjamin Franklin's life, some folks, some of our listeners might know that he had a little black book, and it wasn't a book of women's phone numbers, a little black book that he kept track of the areas he wanted to change in his life. And one of the areas that he wanted to change in his life was he wanted to become more humble. Now, how did he conclude that? Because one of his friends said, you have 11 things in your list. You need to add humility because you're so full of yourself, Ben. And Benjamin Franklin, as a result of that provocation from his friend, he decided, and I'll never forget reading it. I had to go back and listen to it on audio tape. I had to go back. Did he really say that? Benjamin Franklin said, I decided to deny myself the privilege of ever disagreeing with anyone. Now, I talk about hard or soft. That's hard to do. he said, I decided to deny myself the privilege of ever disagreeing with anyone, because he wanted to have humility in conversation. So Doug, let's say you and I are having a conversation and we disagree about something. If I could take a Benjamin Franklin approach, that I might say, now, Doug, I could be mistaken, but is there possibly a different way of looking at that? You notice how that's not disagreeing, that's coming alongside you and looking at the problem in the glass together. So that's how I want to be. And so it doesn't mean not being hard-edged in our thinking. It means being soft in our relationships, still hard-edged in our thinking.
After you left the family company, eventually you started your own firm advising other family businesses. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, thank you, Doug. Yeah, after that dinner with 1,000 people in Toronto, where I shared all of our mistakes, people said, can you help us not get into the same kind of trouble? And so you asked earlier what families can do to avoid the getting into trouble in family business. I mentioned the importance of boards of directors. One of the other things that families can do to help avoid getting into hot water is to have regular family meetings. If families have regular family meetings, they can cultivate open communication, dialogue, have a chance to resolve challenges before they become unmanageable. And so this is one of the things I do with families. I help them to begin to have regular, purposeful family meetings. And often just having a bald guy with a tie in the room makes things go a little differently than if it was just mom and dad and the kids. And people are on their best behavior. So that helps. And then I also provide education. Here's what other people have done that you can learn from. Here are some things that are helpful. So two or three things that I help families work on. One is have regular family meetings. Secondly, back to the board of directors, help families to recruit independent members for their boards of directors. And then the last thing that the research suggests is really important is to ensure that families create some form of strategic planning process. Often families in business are launched by an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs tend to be get it done kind of folks, but they tend to not want to sit down and figure out a strategy and document it. And that's fine. But if you have over time, as you get different generations, second generation, third generation involved, people need to know which way is up. And so having some form of strategic planning process allows the rising generation, the next generation, to say, can I help with that? I'm interested in that part of our plan. Helps make sure that the elder generation communicates to the younger generation where we're going. And so some form of strategic planning process enables people to get on the same page. And I just on that, Doug, years and years ago, when I was just starting in my career, I'm a football fan, as you obviously know. I wrote a letter to Tom Landry, the famous coach of the Dallas Cowboys. And I was 23, and I labored over the letter. It took me hours to, didn't have email at that time. I wrote this letter to Tom Landry, and I'll never forget the beginning. It said, I am a student of management. I'd like to know how you created the winningest football franchise in the history of the National Football League. He wrote me back and he said, training camp starts next week. I got 20 minutes. If you can be in my office by 3:20, I'll give you 20 minutes till 3:40. So we were living in California at the time, drove to the practice, which was being held in Southern California. And I said to Tom, how do you do this? And he said, you have to have a shared philosophy. And I said, what's that mean? And he said, you forget philosophy, David, that's too big a word for you. He said, what you need to do is have an agreed upon focus or vision for where you're going. And he talked about how he wanted to have his team throw lots of passes and not just run the ball all the time. And they had the chance to recruit the Heisman Trophy winner who they interviewed him. They had a chance to draft him. And Tom said, how would you feel about running the ball 20 times a game? And this person said, I want to carry the ball 30 times. So they didn't choose the Heisman Trophy winner because he would have been frustrated only getting the ball 20 times when Tom wanted to have an aerial attack and throwing the ball more. So he said, what's key is to have everybody pull in the same direction. So in a family enterprise, you want to have some form of strategic planning process so everyone can get on the same page and agree on what kind of strategy we're going to have. So those are the three things I do, Doug, help families make sure they get those things in place.
And where can people get more information? How can they contact you?
simply go to my website, nextstepadvisors.ca. If it's CA because I'm a Canadian, so nextstepadvisors.ca. And if they want to get in touch with me, they can order a book from me. We also have, Doug, a very exciting thing we started during COVID. We've developed a coaching and mentoring program for family business successors. Each module is about 3 months. And during that coaching and mentoring program called Emotional Intelligence for Successors, we're helping folks. The first one, for example, looks at 3 topics over 3 months: humility, curiosity, and listening. And so I have group sessions with folks, and then everyone is also given the chance to work privately one-on-one with a coach. And so we're trying to help the next generation avoid the mistakes David made. And, I've written a book about these things, but we're not going to cultivate emotional intelligence just by reading a book. So we've put this mentoring and coaching program in place to help young people from around the world who are family business successors. So nextstepadvisors.ca, you can learn more about my book or how I might be able to help with one of these programs, such as the emotional intelligence for successors.
And David, a last question, and that is, what would you like to add that we have not had a chance to talk about? Could be anything.
Well, I'd like to talk about patience, because when I went to our family company and my dad wanted me to lead the family company, I went and sat down with I'm a bit of a planner, so I sat down with my uncle and I said, here are the 5 different ways I think I can be ready to be president of the company when you retire. Now that might seem really presumptuous, but my dad had been encouraging me since grade 5 to prepare for this. And my uncle said, David, I think it would have to be a 20-year training program, not a 10-year training program. And so my dad and my uncle argued. My dad said, David can be already in 10. Bob said, you have to be 20. You have to be 20 years. And so, I was 23 at the time. So I might have had to wait till I was 43. And I think that if I was to go to 2 main things that got me in trouble, one was humility, which we've talked about. The other was my lack of patience. And I think, in today's world, we go to Starbucks, and I have a friend who won't go to Starbucks because he can't stand waiting in the line in the drive-thru. That's too long, right? So, we need to cultivate patience. And I'm very inspired by Fisk Johnson, who's now the CEO of SC Johnson. And what did he do? He wanted to lead their family company one day, but his dad was there and he was a strong leader. And so Fisk thought, well, rather than trying to butt heads with my dad, I'm just going to go and finish not just 1 degree, but I'm going to take a master's in physics. And then he thought, we're a business, so maybe I'll take a master's in business as well. And then he thought, well, I've got a master's in physics. Why don't I take a PhD in physics? And so patiently, he continued to add to his credentials, Doug. Fisk Johnson got 6 earned degrees. And then he joined the family company at age 30, and then patiently waited 17 more years until he had a chance to be appointed president. Well, if I had waited that long, I would. If I waited the 20 years my uncle wanted, I would have been president of our family company by the time I was 43. Sam waited till he was 47. And I think that if I could speak to all of our listeners, cultivate your humility, get over yourself, but also to cultivate patience, because I think that can be an enormous challenge for the next generation, because we want things now. And I'm not saying we should wait around and do nothing. Okay, if Fisk Johnson got busy and added to his credentials, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have, Doug.
You've been watching the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.